There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a place when everyone inside it has agreed, without ever quite saying so out loud, not to talk. Buckingham Palace has that silence built into its walls. Hundreds of rooms, hundreds of staff moving through corridors most of the public will never see, and decades upon decades of arrangements, agreements, and unwritten rules designed to make sure that whatever happens inside stays inside until, every so often, it doesn't. The story of the royal family the public knows is the story that was allowed to leak out, carefully, slowly, sometimes accidentally, sometimes not. The real story, the one that happened behind those walls while the cameras were pointed somewhere else, is messier, stranger, and far more human than the polished version anyone was ever supposed to see. To understand how secrets survive inside a royal household, you have to understand the culture built around the people who work there. For centuries, royal service has come with an unspoken code, sometimes formalized into actual contracts, sometimes simply absorbed by anyone who spends long enough in those corridors. Staff are trained almost from their first day to understand that what they see, hear, and overhear belongs to the household, not to them. Footmen, maids, chefs, private secretaries, even the people who walk the corgis, all operate under a kind of professional omerta, a quiet understanding that loyalty is repaid with continued employment, a pension, a reference, sometimes even a modest title, and that breaking it can end a career instantly and permanently. This isn't unique to royalty. Plenty of wealthy households run on similar codes, but very few households in the world have managed to maintain that level of discipline across so many decades, through so many scandals, with so few major leaks actually tracing back to staff themselves. Most of what eventually surfaces about life behind the walls comes out years later, through memoirs written long after someone has left service, through journalists who spent years building trust with sources, or through the family members themselves choosing, for their own reasons, to finally say something. One of the most haunting examples of what the institution chose to keep hidden involves two women almost nobody had heard of for most of the 20th century. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon were first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II, daughters of a brother of the Queen Mother. Both women lived with severe developmental disabilities, and in the 1940s, their family made the decision to have them placed in a specialist institution where official paperwork at the time bizarrely listed them as having already died. They had not died. They lived for decades inside that institution, largely forgotten by the outside world, while official royal reference books continued to describe them as deceased. It wasn't until the 1980s that journalists uncovered the truth, revealing that two close living relatives of the monarch had spent most of their lives quietly hidden away, a story that shocked the public not because it proved any single person was monstrous, but because it revealed just how far an aristocratic family of that era would go to manage the appearance of perfection, even at the cost of two real, living women's visibility and dignity. Secrets behind those walls weren't always so tragic. Some were simply officer named Peter Townsend, a war hero working within the royal household. Townsend was divorced, and in an era when the Church of England still considered remarriage after divorce deeply controversial, especially for a senior royal, the relationship became an enormous, quietly managed crisis inside the palace. Behind the scenes, courtiers, clergy, and government ministers debated for months what should happen, weighing public sentiment, religious doctrine, and the family's own standing. Margaret was ultimately told that marrying Townsend would mean giving up her royal income, her title privileges, and her place within the family's official life. She chose, in the end, not to marry him, a decision made under enormous private pressure that the public only understood in fragments at the time, framed in the press as a romantic, tragic choice rather than what it actually was. A young woman being maneuvered by an institution terrified of how the optics might damage it. Few scandals capture the tension between palace secrecy and the people who actually live inside that world, quite like the story of Marion Crawford, known affectionately within the family as Crawfie. She served for years as governess to the young Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, living inside the household, present for countless private, ordinary family moments most historians would have loved access to. When she eventually retired and wrote a gentle, fairly affectionate memoir about her time raising the princesses, the family's reaction wasn't gratitude, it was fury. Despite the book containing little that could be described as scandalous by modern standards, simply warm, human details about a childhood normally kept entirely private, Crawfie was effectively shunned by the family for the rest of her life. She was never spoken to by them again, reportedly never fully recovering from the heartbreak of being cut off from people she had cared for like her own family. The lesson the rest of the household took from her story was unmistakable, and it rippled through generations of staff who came after her. Even affectionate honesty about life inside those walls would be treated as betrayal. The most dramatic example of behind-the-scenes maneuvering remains the abdication crisis of 1936, and what's often left out of the popular romantic version of that story is just how much frantic, secretive political negotiation happened away from public view before anyone outside a small circle knew anything was wrong. King Edward VIII's relationship with the American divorcee Wallis Simpson set off weeks of private meetings between the king, the prime minister, senior clergy, and key advisors, all desperately trying to find a solution that wouldn't force a constitutional crisis. Plans were floated and rejected behind closed doors, including arrangements that might have allowed a morganatic marriage, one where Simpson would never become queen, but the king could remain married to her. Government officials worried about precedent, about the church's stance on divorce, about public reaction across the Commonwealth. By the time the public finally learned what was happening, the outcome had effectively already been decided in private rooms days or weeks earlier. The romantic abdication speech the public eventually heard was the very last beat of a drama that had already played out almost entirely behind palace walls. Technology eventually broke through some of that protective silence in ways the institution never fully recovered from. The late 1980s and early 1990s brought a particularly brutal stretch of leaked private phone calls that exposed just how unhappy and strained several royal marriages had become. A recorded conversation between Princess Diana and a close friend, intimate, emotionally raw, and clearly never meant for public ears, was leaked to tabloids and became known in the press as one of the most invasive royal scandals of the era. Around the same time, a separate leaked recording captured an extraordinarily personal, unguarded conversation involving Prince Charles, revealing the depth of his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles years before the public was prepared to accept it. These leaks didn't just embarrass individuals, they shattered the illusion that anything happening behind palace walls was actually safe from the outside world. For an institution whose entire power depended on controlling what got revealed and when, suddenly finding its most intimate, unscripted moments broadcast on the evening news was a kind of violation it had never had to plan for. What those leaked calls revealed, more than any single juicy detail, was the sheer unhappiness simmering beneath decades of formal portraits and polished public appearances. Diana's own private struggles, including a long battle with bulimia that she later spoke about candidly herself, had been happening for years, while the public only saw a glowing young princess attending galas and charity events. Friends and household staff at the time were reportedly aware something was wrong, but the culture of discretion meant almost nobody outside a tight circle said anything publicly until Diana herself eventually chose to speak about it directly. It's a pattern that shows up again and again behind those walls, genuine suffering, hidden for years not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of an institutional reflex that treats any admission of internal struggle as a threat to the family's image rather than a human problem deserving compassion and support. Family decision-making itself happens through structures most people have never heard of, designed specifically to keep major decisions away from public scrutiny until they're ready to be announced as settled fact. For years, senior working royals have periodically gathered in private meetings, sometimes referred to informally as discussions about the future shape and size of the monarchy, debating who should be considered a full-time working royal, how the family's public role should evolve, and how to balance modernizing the institution against preserving its traditions. These conversations happen entirely out of public view, often involving difficult, sometimes painful disagreements about which family members get prominent public duties, financial support, and official recognition, and which that kind of closed-door decision-making became impossible to ignore in January of 2020 when tensions between Prince Harry, Meghan, and the rest of the family came to a head. After the couple publicly announced their intention to step back from full-time royal duties, senior family members gathered at Sandringham for a famously tense, urgently scheduled meeting to decide how to respond. What emerged afterward was a brief, carefully worded statement describing a constructive, supportive conversation about a transition period. What actually happened inside that room, the tone, the disagreements, the hurt feelings on multiple sides, was never fully disclosed to the public, and likely never will be in complete detail. It remains one of the clearest modern examples of an institution making an enormous, emotionally fraught decision entirely behind closed doors, then releasing only the smallest, most controlled summary of what had actually occurred. Money has its own quiet history of secrets behind those walls as well. For years, the family's private finances, separate from the public funding provided through the sovereign grant, remained almost entirely opaque to outside scrutiny. That changed somewhat when a major leak of financial documents, known publicly as the Paradise Papers, revealed that a portion of the late Queen's private estate had been invested through offshore funds, including investments connected to a retail company later criticized for its treatment of struggling high street businesses. The revelations didn't suggest anything illegal had occurred. Offshore investment structures are legal and common among wealthy individuals and institutions worldwide, but they did puncture a long-maintained image of a family whose wealth existed somewhere above the messy realities of modern finance. It was a reminder that behind the ceremonial appearances and charitable patronages, the family's money moves through the same complicated, sometimes ethically uncomfortable financial systems used by any other extremely wealthy estate. Perhaps the most serious example of secrecy colliding with real consequences in recent memory involves Prince Andrew, whose association with the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein eventually led to his complete removal from public royal duties and the loss of his military affiliations and royal patronages. For years prior to that fallout becoming public, questions about the nature of that friendship were largely confined to private conversations among advisors and family members, with the institution's instinct being to manage the relationship quietly rather than confront it directly. By the time it became impossible to manage privately any longer, the damage to public trust was severe enough that the family made the decision to distance itself from him entirely and publicly. A stark illustration of how far the institution will go to protect itself once a private problem becomes one it can no longer keep behind closed doors. Even death, the most universal and unavoidable event a family will ever face, happens behind a remarkable amount of private planning inside the royal household. For decades, detailed contingency plans existed for exactly how each senior member of the family's eventual passing would be handled, who would be notified first, how government officials would be looped in, what ceremonial processes would unfold, and in what order, often known internally by discrete code names. These plans are revised quietly for years, sometimes decades, before they're ever needed, treated with the same careful, methodical secrecy as any other sensitive palace matter. The public only ever sees the final, polished result, a flawlessly organized period of mourning that looks to outside eyes like simple tradition unfolding naturally. In reality, it's the product of meetings held behind palace walls long before anyone outside that small circle knew such planning was even happening. Behind those walls, there's also an entire ecosystem of internal politics that rarely gets discussed outside biographies written by people who spent years building trust with palace insiders. The private secretaries and senior courtiers who run the day-to-day machinery of royal life have historically wielded enormous, largely invisible influence over which family members get prominent public roles, which get sidelined, and how internal disputes get resolved. For generations, these advisors were informally nicknamed the men in gray suits, a phrase that captures both their literal appearance and the sense that they operated as a kind of permanent, unelected government inside the institution, often outlasting the reigns of the very monarchs they served. Disagreements between competing households, say, the office supporting one generation's heir against the office supporting another senior royal, have at various points become genuinely fierce, with each side reportedly briefing favorable stories to friendly journalists about their own boss while subtly undermining the other. The public rarely sees this rivalry directly, but it shapes an enormous amount of what eventually appears in print, since competing private offices have, at different points in recent history, become sources for stories that cast a sibling or cousin in an unflattering light. Christmas at Sandringham has long been treated publicly as a picture of warm traditional family unity. The long walk to church, the matching outfits, the cheerful waves to well-wishers gathered outside the gates. Behind the scenes, however, royal Christmases have reportedly involved their own share of tension. Seating arrangements debated in advance to keep certain relatives at a comfortable distance from each other, strict daily schedules built around the late Queen's own preferences for punctuality and structure, and, in difficult years, genuinely painful undercurrents running beneath the cheerful photographs. Biographers have written about gatherings held in the immediate aftermath of major family ruptures, divorces, public scandals, falling outs between siblings, where everyone still showed up, smiled for the cameras, and exchanged gifts exactly as tradition demanded, while privately barely speaking to each other once the doors closed. The discipline required to maintain that performance, year after year, regardless of what was actually happening inside the family, says something remarkable about just how deeply ingrained the habit of compartmentalizing private pain really is inside that world. 1992 became known, in the Queen's own words during a now famous speech, as her annus horribilis, a phrase that became shorthand for one of the most brutal years the institution had faced in living memory. Within the span of months, 3 of her children's marriages were publicly disintegrating. A devastating fire tore through a significant portion of Windsor Castle, and the press was growing increasingly aggressive in its coverage of the family's private failings. What the public didn't see in real time was the sheer volume of private crisis meetings happening that year, urgent conversations about how to handle separating couples, whose every move was being tracked by photographers, debates over who would pay for the castle's expensive restoration at a moment when public sympathy for royal spending was thin and quiet, painful conversations within the family about whether the institution itself could survive this level of sustained, simultaneous embarrassment. The Annus Horribilis speech itself, delivered publicly with a slightly hoarse voice that observers noted seemed to betray real exhaustion, was one of the rare moments the institution allowed even a sliver of that private strain to show through in public. Prince Charles's own childhood has, over the decades, become the subject of considerable private reflection that only became public knowledge gradually through interviews and biographies written long after the fact. Raised in an era when child-rearing among the aristocracy still leaned heavily on nannies and structured distance from parents, accounts from people close to the family describe a boy who experienced his parents, particularly his father, as emotionally remote during crucial years of his upbringing. Sent to boarding schools he reportedly found difficult and lonely despite their prestige. None of this was discussed publicly at the time it was happening. It surfaced only later in fragments, as Charles himself, his biographers, and people who worked closely with the family began speaking more openly about the emotional cost of growing up inside an institution that prized composure and duty over open displays of affection. It offers a quieter, sadder counterpoint to the abdication dramas and tabloid scandals, a reminder that some of what happened behind those walls wasn't scandalous at all, simply ordinary human loneliness, hidden behind privilege and protocol. Princess Margaret's private life, away from the cameras, developed its own quiet mythology over the years as well. Long after her relationship with Peter Townsend ended, she built a reputation among those close to her for a far more bohemian, freewheeling lifestyle than the public ever fully grasped, particularly during long stretches spent at her private villa on the Caribbean island of Mustique, where friends and biographers have described lively, unconventional gatherings far removed from the formality expected of her back home. The contrast between Margaret's public role, glamorous but dutiful, and her private reputation for enjoying a far less restrained social life became one of the open secrets among people who moved in those circles, rarely confirmed explicitly but widely understood. It's a smaller, gentler example of the same basic pattern running through almost every story in this history: a carefully maintained public face and a much more complicated human reality kept just out of view behind it. Even Prince Harry's own struggles, eventually discussed at length in his own memoir and interviews, illustrate how long certain private difficulties can be managed quietly before a family member chooses to bring them into the open themselves. Long before he spoke publicly about his own mental health struggles following his mother's death, about grief he said he had suppressed for years, and about experiences with substances he later described candidly in his own words, those difficulties existed entirely behind the scenes, known only to a small circle of family, friends, and household staff. The decision to eventually discuss them publicly, on his own terms, rather than having them surface through leaks or tabloid investigation, represented a notable break from the institution's traditional approach of keeping such struggles permanently behind closed doors. Whether that openness ultimately helped or further strained his relationship with the rest of the family remains, fittingly, a subject debated mostly through carefully worded public statements, while the more candid version of that story almost certainly continues to play out in conversations the public will never be allowed to hear. The private personality of Queen Elizabeth II herself became one of the more pleasant surprises to emerge from decades of insider accounts, a sharp contrast to her famously composed, almost unreadable public persona. People who worked closely with her for years have described a woman with a quick, dry sense of humor, fond of doing impressions of visiting dignitaries once they'd left the room, deeply knowledgeable about horse breeding and racing in a way few outside her closest circles ever appreciated, and capable of surprisingly mischievous behavior, including a now famous moment captured by a former aide describing how she once arranged a playful surprise for security staff who hadn't yet recognized her on a country walk near Balmoral. None of this regularly reached the public during her lifetime, since the institution generally preferred to maintain the image of measured, almost regal seriousness rather than risk diluting her authority with too much visible personality. It took retirements, memoirs, and documentaries made well after certain events to reveal just how much warmth and humor existed behind the formal exterior the public came to expect from her for over 70 years, not long before any royal wedding happens. An entire private vetting process unfolds behind the scenes that the public only ever sees the tail end of, usually in the form of a smiling, official engagement photograph. Kate Middleton's own years dating Prince William before their eventual marriage became something of a public spectacle in tabloids, who nicknamed her Weighty Katie in reference to how long the relationship continued without a formal proposal, but few outside the family fully understood at the time just how much quiet, deliberate evaluation was happening behind the scenes during those years. Partners brought into that world are reportedly assessed not just by the family member dating them, but informally by senior courtiers and even other family members, weighing how a prospective spouse might handle the unique pressures of royal life, how comfortable they seem with the press, and how well they might be expected to fit into the institution's existing rhythms and expectations. Meghan Markle's own, later, much more publicly discussed account of struggling with isolation, scrutiny, and a lack of institutional support during her early years in the family, offered one of the most candid descriptions yet of what that vetting and integration process can actually feel like once you're living inside it, rather than simply being evaluated from a comfortable distance beforehand. War years produced their own carefully buried chapter of royal history, one that took decades to surface in full. After abdicating, the former King Edward VIII, by then known as the Duke of Windsor, spent time in the years leading up to the Second World War in ways that later raised serious concerns among British officials, including documented contact with figures connected to Nazi Germany, and private commentary that worried even his own family about where his sympathies might actually lie. Wartime government officials reportedly viewed him as enough of a security and propaganda risk that he was eventually sent to serve as governor of the Bahamas, a posting widely understood at the time behind closed doors as a way of keeping him safely out of Europe and away from any further opportunity to be used or quoted by the wrong people. Files and correspondence relating to this period remained classified for decades after the war ended, gradually released only as historians pushed for access, revealing just how seriously the institution and the government had quietly worried about one of its own former kings during one of the most dangerous periods in modern history. Staff turnover itself has occasionally told its own quiet story about tension behind the walls, particularly during the years immediately following Diana's divorce and death, when royal correspondents covering the family at the time noted an unusually high churn of private secretaries, press officers, and household staff at Kensington Palace. Some of that turnover reflected ordinary career movement, but biographers and former staff members have also described periods of real internal strain, disagreements over how aggressively to manage the press, frustration among advisors who felt unsupported by the wider family during a uniquely difficult period, and the simple emotional toll of working inside a household that was, by any definition, in genuine crisis. None of that internal churn was ever explained publicly in any detail at the time. It simply showed up, if you were paying close attention, as a steady, unremarked upon rotation of new names attached to the same old job titles, a quiet signal that something behind the scenes wasn't running as smoothly as the official statements always suggested. Their quote, S. Also a financial and personal history surrounding the Queen Mother that stayed remarkably well contained for someone so publicly beloved during her lifetime. Widely regarded by the British public as a warm, grandmotherly figure devoted to charity and tradition, she was also known among household insiders for a fondness for gin, horse racing bets, and a personal spending style that, according to several biographers and former staff, regularly outpaced what her formal allowance was meant to cover, leading on more than one occasion to her overdraft being quietly settled by other parts of the family's finances rather than become a public embarrassment. None of this ever significantly damaged her public image during her lifetime, partly because journalists of that era were far more reluctant to scrutinize an elderly, widely adored royal figure, and partly because the institution was, as always, extremely effective at keeping awkward financial details exactly where they belonged, behind closed doors, discussed only among accountants, private secretaries, and family members who understood the importance of never letting that particular story reach the front page. Even something as seemingly mundane as the day-to-day rhythm of palace life involves a level of behind-the-scenes choreography most people would find almost absurd. Former staff have described strict daily schedules built around specific timings for meals, correspondence, and even something as small as the precise temperature certain rooms needed to be kept at for the late Queen's comfort, alongside elaborate protocols dictating who could speak to her directly, in what order guests should be presented, and how long any single conversation at an informal garden party was permitted to last before staff would discreetly intervene to keep things moving. None of this rigidity was visible in the relaxed, warm impression most garden party guests came away with, because managing that illusion of effortless, gracious informality was, itself, the entire point of the planning happening invisibly around them. Visitors left feeling they'd shared a genuinely personal moment with royalty, never realizing the precise number of seconds allotted to that moment had been worked out by someone else entirely, hours or even days beforehand. What ties all of these stories together? The hidden cousins, the loyal governess cast aside, the leaked phone calls, the tense family summit, the quiet financial arrangements, the family member quietly removed from public life, is a single, consistent pattern. Behind every polished public moment the royal family has ever presented, there has always been a parallel, hidden process of decision-making, damage control, grief, negotiation, and very human struggle that the public was never meant to witness in real time. Some of it eventually came out through journalism, some through memoirs written decades later, some through leaks nobody could have predicted, and some almost certainly never came out at all and never will. The palace walls were never just architecture. They were, and remain, one of the most effective information barriers any modern institution has ever built, a barrier strong enough to survive world wars, technological revolutions, and generational change, cracking only slightly, only occasionally, just enough to remind the rest of us that the people living behind them were never quite as composed, as certain, or as untroubled as the photographs always made them look.